We need to talk about ideas, good ones and bad ones. We need to learn stuff about the world. We need an honest, intelligent, thought-provoking, and entertaining review of what the hell happened on this planet in the last 7 days. We need to sit back and listen to the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove.
Welcome back, dear listener. Yes, this is the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove podcast. The lights have nearly fallen over Paul.
Cheers, Warren.
Electrocuted him, yes.
Oh, dear.
But we've overcome that.
Thanks, mate.
This is the Iron Fist Velvet Glove podcast. I, of course, am Trevor, a.k.a. the Iron Fist. With me, as always, Paul, the 12th man.
Greetings, Earthlings.
And also was the beer sponsor.
G'day, listeners.
So, dear listener, good news. A couple of weeks' time, we're going to have Scott back on. More about that at a later date. So,
Yay, Scott.
Looking forward to it.
So this is episode 258, and we're coming up to a 5-year anniversary, I was just mentioning, in a couple of weeks' time. So before we go on with tonight's topics, in case I forget, next week, no guarantee of a podcast. I'm away, and I'm not sure what I'll be doing. So if there is one, it may even be on Monday rather than on Tuesday. So all a bit up in the air for next week. So, but definitely the week after that, we'll be back to celebrate 5 years. So there we go. Right. Well, we've spent a lot of time, Paul, over the years talking about, actually, before we get on to the sort of all the issues of the statues being torn down and movies and books being banned and all the rest of it, got some feedback last week because we did we talked about Indigenous incarceration, and I thought we did our best to be really fair and as best we could, give an honest interpretation of what we thought was going on. Got some feedback from a lot of people, maybe a handful actually, that was very positive. People said, really good episode, really enjoyed it, thanks very much. Only one negative feedback, which was from Graham, who's a patron, who said, disappointed that you indulged in a popular pastime of whitefellas of making sweeping generalisations about Australian Aboriginals without actually involving an Australian Aboriginal. Do better next time, please, Trevor. Angry face. So, Graham, that really pissed me off, Graham. And you know when you get you get angry and you want to, if you're going to fire off an email and they say, just sleep on it overnight and don't send it straight away. Just think about it, and then if you're still angry, then send
Good
it. Sort of
advice.
thing. I'm still angry.
Have you sent the email?
No,
yet?
but I guess this is the chance now to sort of talk about some of the issues, because it's not so much my personal thin skin, which is thin, but it's more about the issues involved that is the important part. So really, Graham seems to be suggesting that our podcast was unbalanced and we needed to give time to alternative views from the Aboriginal perspective, I think is what he's hinting at. Mm-hmm. Or maybe that there are issues here which we couldn't possibly understand because we don't have the lived experience of being Indigenous. Could be either of those things or both of those things. So dealing with first part is the whole sort of stereotypical Indigenous viewpoint of what's going on in terms of incarceration and the plight of Indigenous Australians. That stereotypical view is pretty well out there, I would have thought, from Q&A and multiple ABC programs and Guardian articles and essays and even right-wing papers where Noel Pearson and others get to have their say on what they think is going on in the world. So I don't think there's a lack of people knowing what that view is in terms of the traditional stereotypical version of what Indigenous people think about the incarceration rates and whatever. So really, what we were saying about culture is not a view that you hear anywhere. So
It's certainly not a view that you hear from most of the Indigenous spokespeople, is it?
I haven't heard it from anybody.
They scrupulously avoid making any reference to any causality in their culture, don't they? Except for Jacinta Price, of course.
Yeah. So our discussion was really a response to what's already been said. And so really, and that's sort of ideas that we were giving, I don't think it's airtime. So I don't have any problem with what we did that way. And we actually did call for listeners to zoom in and push back, and I actually thought that Paul, who zoomed in, was going to give a lot more pushback than what he did, because based on his previous correspondence with me about Dark Emu, I thought he was going to. So, Graham, we called for anybody to zoom in, and whether they were black, white or brindle, they could have. And all we got was Paul, who mostly agreed with our position, although he's since said he would have added to it if he'd sort of listened to the first part a bit more. So here's the real thing that I want to say is, though, suggesting an Aboriginal guest, I reckon, is insulting to Indigenous people at one level, because it assumes all Indigenous people think the same in some way. If I invited Jacinta Price, Graham may have said, well, not that sort of Aboriginal in terms of inviting somebody on. I don't know, but there's sort of the implication you didn't invite an Aboriginal was, well, are they going to give you this common view of the Aboriginal person that you're missing out on, or are they going to give you one of any number of views that you've already canvassed in the various things that you've been quoting? I really reject that idea that somebody can speak on behalf of the Indigenous population as if they all think the same way. So I wouldn't pretend to speak on behalf of white people's views on anything, because I know that they would have a multitude of views on things. So,
True.
So there's that. What else have I got here? So there's an open invitation. If you do know somebody, Graham, or anybody out there who is Indigenous or non-Indigenous but wants to push back against what we said, then there's an open invitation. Make contact. We'll have you on.
I think you have in the past tried to contact Jacinta Price, haven't you?
I did once, but I didn't push it. But because one of the reasons why is I figure she gets her viewpoint out there. Like,
she does.
If people want to know it, they'll know it. But my point is, if somebody's going to come on, then they've got to argue the issues we've raised and the positions we've taken. And simply saying you're a white fella and you're blinded by your privilege, that's not good enough. That's not going to get us anywhere. So it might sound arrogant, but the ideas that we put forward in that episode are not what you hear everywhere, and I want people to address those ideas. So if you know somebody, black, white or polka dot, who wants to counteract those ideas, we'll talk to them. But they can't just say, oh, I'm black, you're white, you wouldn't know because you're just privileged. I'm just not interested in that conversation.
I imagine that invitation extends to Graham himself.
Yeah, indeed.
And have a chat.
Indeed. And as for sweeping generalisations, well, when you talk about culture, you're generalising about people and groups of people.
Yeah, you can't possibly cover every possible variation of individual opinion.
Indeed.
In a given, if you like, ethnic group or, physical type.
Yes.
Which is pretty well irrelevant anyway.
So, sweeping generalisations is what we're all about here. Because, that's what we do, is make sweeping generalisations.
And everybody does,
yes.
because it's the only way you can really talk about anything.
That's right.
In a
any
general sense.
Any study of society course, like the one we're conducting, is going to have sweeping generalisations.
Yeah.
If you don't like sweeping generalisations, stop watching or listening to this podcast. That's what you're going to get. Of course, there'll be exceptions. Of course, there are individuals who don't fit the mould.
Yeah.
Of course, it goes without saying that there will be people who are outliers in any event. So.
Were you also offended that Graham suggested you were just another average Aussie with average Aussie opinions? Whatever that is.
I don't know about that so much, but I do want to say this, though, that having an Indigenous heritage wouldn't necessarily make somebody a valuable commentator on Indigenous social trends. So a few weeks ago, we were going to invite a Chinese lady to discuss China in our China episode. And she admitted later, when she listened to it, that we knew a lot more about Chinese history than what she did to some extent. So just, I'm not American, but I'm convinced I've got a deeper understanding about America's place in the world than a lot of Americans do.
Indeed.
So an individual Indigenous person would no doubt be able to offer anecdotes of their life experience as things have happened to them, but is not necessarily capable of insightful advice on Indigenous social trends. Like, if they've had a fairly insular life with their own family and haven't done a broad reading of the general trends in their own culture, they could be completely oblivious to lots of things, as many white people are to white social trends.
As people are everywhere.
Yeah, just being black won't make you an expert.
Indeed.
So I make that point, and without really banging on, I'm going to skip over a few of the things that I said. We've spoken about lots of groups. We speak about Chinese, Americans, communist, capitalists. We very, very, very rarely invite anybody on, but we bag Christians all the time.
And you have had
I have had a Christian on,
yeah.
yes, one. So just because we didn't invite Indigenous people on, but Graham, did you think to yourself on those other occasions when we spoke about other groups, did you think to yourself, why don't they have a Chinese person on? You're talking about China all the time. Why don't you have or is it just because you've got a particular feeling about Indigenous people that they're somehow victims more so than others and are especially deserving of a voice that you didn't feel applied in those other cultural groups? It's just interesting that you chose this one as when we've generalised about all sorts of cultural groups, but we don't have them on. I find that sort of interesting. And the other thing is, just going back to Christians as an example, who would know more about the origins of the Bible? Us or your average Christian?
It's a great point, Trevor.
Yes.
And I'm sure you would agree. And you have taken a great interest in Christianity and read a lot about it. I have the same. I often find when I meet Christians and start talking about it, I know actually more about religion than they do.
Yes.
And even more about Christianity than they do.
Indeed. So we did a whole podcast on the origins of the Bible, and no one complained that there were no Christians. And if you were to ask a Christian about their lived experience, many would tell of a tale of persecution that has no resemblance to reality. Many of them would talk about, the marriage equality laws, abortion laws, other secular laws would be described by Christians as an affront and an insult to them and their God.
Indeed.
Now, would they be right? It's their lived experience as a Christian as they would testify to us, but that doesn't necessarily make it right.
Objectively, it doesn't make it true, does it?
Indeed. Just because it comes from the mouth of somebody who has that identity doesn't mean it's actually correct. The ideas are up for debate.
This is really a theme, isn't it, in the current era of people who think that feelings are more valid than facts, and that it's the lived experience which is what you really have to understand, not the objectively observed experience.
Yes, and the ideas that are presented.
Exactly,
just who it comes from seems to be more important. So we're not the first media group to be criticised because the Insiders got criticised. So ABC Insiders did a discussion on the same sort of topic, and they didn't have any Indigenous person present as part of their panel. Uproar from people.
Effrontery of the ABC.
That's right. So the next week they got on an Indigenous spokesperson who was Bridget Brennan, who is their ABC Europe correspondent. Previously, or maybe currently, based in London. She was previously the ABC's National Indigenous Affairs correspondent, covering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs across Australia, and she's worked as a reporter in Sydney, Melbourne, Darwin and Hong Kong. Now,
she was on this week, wasn't she? On Sunday, on the last edition of the Insiders.
Probably to make up for the fact they didn't have anybody the previous week, so there was sort of like as
pretty sure that was her. I'm not 100%.
Probably would have been. So here's where we get into some tricky territory. She seemed to me to have been brought up by her mother, and she admitted that she didn't have a lot of contact with her culture and felt some disconnection with it that she only managed to achieve later in life, kind of reading between the lines, once she got the job at the ABC and started as an Indigenous affairs reporter and managed to connect with her culture and travel around the country and whatnot. She's travelled the world as a correspondent. Like, when we're talking about being able to understand Indigenous, I couldn't understand because of my privilege. Is she any less privileged than me, is the question.
Doesn't sound like it.
Just because you've got dark skin, if you've led a life of privilege, totally alien to an Indigenous person living in a camp on a scrubby creek in a remote part of Australia, like, are you that much closer to them than what I am, really? But that seemed to assuage all of the problems that we're in. Oh, well, okay, you've got your Indigenous spokesperson now, you've kind of ticked off the box. But really, her lived experience, if that's what's important, was nowhere near close enough to the truly disadvantaged life of an Indigenous person that's going to end up in jail, it seemed to me.
And in fact, there would be some white people who would probably have a lot more personal experience with Indigenous people than some Indigenous people.
Indeed.
And I was following
it's about class.
Yeah. I was following an online forum discussion recently, and there was some discussion of Indigenous matters, and there was a woman who was contributing to the discussion, and she was a white woman, and people were saying to her, what would you know? And she said, well, I married an Indigenous man, and I've got Indigenous kids and, cousins and uncles and aunts, and lived in that community with Indigenous people for probably, 20, 30 years or something.
Yes.
So she said, yeah, actually, I do know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
And fair enough too.
Yeah. So,
Good point.
So anyway, all those points. So it all comes down to identity politics, which is what we've been railing against from way back in the beginning. Like with this podcast, we sort of started off looking at religion and promoting secular ideas, but it very quickly became apparent that we had to get our heads around the ideas of identity politics because they were being used by Christian groups as much as others, and it's something we've been talking about for a long time. So identity politics emphasises the identity of the speaker as opposed to the merit of their ideas. It superficially objects to racism, but it entrenches it by ascribing value to something based on the race of the speaker. And that's necessarily going to lead to a backlash as the white majority adopts the same identity strategy and identifies as white people. Invariably as white nationalists, unfortunately, it seems to be. Yep. So it's a really deeply flawed way of looking at the world and a way of judging and a way of arguing and a way of debating to be saying who's making this statement, what's the colour of their skin. You can ask who is it as in what are their qualifications, what have they studied, who's paying them, what funny donations have they received, what inherent biases might be there, but ultimately, what's the idea? Yeah. Is the idea of merit or not? So that's what's important.
Wouldn't you think it was the bleeding obvious? So, I mean, why haven't all these people who claim that realised that, what you look like on the outside doesn't determine what happens on the inside of your head?
Yeah. So just to finish off with Graham's complaint is, Graham, I probably spent about 16 to 20 hours preparing that podcast. Like there was a lot of prep in that, more than this podcast, this particular episode, but there was a lot in that. Yeah. And I spent about 5 years practicing my delivery on that as well. And if I was to try and find an Indigenous spokesperson, organise them to come on, research what they're about, involve them in the discussion, that probably would have added another 15 to 20 hours in there. I'm doing this part-time, mate. I don't have it, so I don't have that time. So I can't do any better, and you need to lower your expectations. So there we go. There's my whinge.
Do you feel better?
I do. I got that off my chest.
That's good.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So, gentlemen, the thought police are out.
Indeed.
Worldwide. We've got a few different things. We've got removing of television shows and movies from sort of back catalogues. We've got removing statues and tearing them down. Yep. and we've got mass displays of contrition with footballers kneeling at the beginning of games. I've talked enough. Feel free to grab any one of those ideas and run with it in your
What do you
thoughts.
think, Warren? Yeah.
My thoughts is, where's it going to stop? You know, they're tearing down statues and they're taking TV shows off the air. Like, do we rename mountain ranges? Do we?
They've already done it in
rename
Western
suburbs? Do we rename parks or even street names? Like what?
The King Leopold Ranges.
Where do we draw the line on all of this?
In Western Australia are going to be renamed.
Are they?
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yep.
Yeah, but you're right. Where does it stop? You know, I mean, what if just hypothetically, someone discovered that John Utzon, the designer of the Sydney Opera House, had been a rabid racist? What do? We tear it down?
No.
No, it'd be a bit of a world shame.
But if it was
to leave it there?
let me play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Okay. If it was the Jorn Utzon Opera House, would we just change it to the Sydney Opera House, though, having discovered that he was a bad character?
Well, it's already just the Sydney Opera House.
I know.
But I mean,
Yeah.
but now I mean, as Warren said, where does it stop?
But a lot of this comes to naming of things. We did one years ago, just outside of, I think it was Ipswich. There was a stadium called the Nigger Brown Stadium.
That's right. Yes.
Yes.
That was a big deal, wasn't it?
How do you feel about that one? That was renamed because
I haven't got a problem with the nigger word. I'm not even going to say the N word.
Okay, right. So you
already said
you
it
would have
too
left
late.
the stadium unchanged. The name of it.
Yeah, I would have left it the same.
Right.
I would have too, to be honest, because I, again, don't think words carry any inherent power. It's only the power we give them. It's because it's a purely symbolic system, language, and it only has the meaning that we give it, you know?
Words have a generally accepted meaning, though.
They do, but meanings also change, and the value of words change, like, you know, prick and cunt and things like that.
Yes, but at a certain time, a word has a certain meaning, and you can't get around that. So it's quite a demeaning word. In the current time, it's a very demeaning word.
Depends on who says it.
Yes, if a black man says it to another black man, then it's okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Yep.
What do you think?
And again, that's context and meaning. But
So it's not the word, it's who's
well,
saying
it is the word
and the word.
It's a word in a context. Like words always have a context.
But look, it's
I
also
think it's the intent. You know, if you're using the intent to demean somebody, don't use it that way. But if you're
the
just
person it was named after
having
wasn't
a
black
conversation
person
about
anyway,
the
was it?
word nigger.
Was it a black person?
yeah, I'm pretty sure it was.
You sure?
Yes. Yeah,
I don't know.
I'm pretty sure it was.
Well, you're probably right, but I'm just not sure. Look, what about...
You'd have to look at the details of that. It's probably how he referred to himself as well.
Look, he may well have, and at that time when that was done, it was within the boundaries of what was socially acceptable. But we can, what is socially acceptable does change over time.
Well,
In the future, eating animals might be deemed to be socially unacceptable. So are they going to tear down the statue of every non-vegan person throughout history?
Indeed. And,
might have to.
And at a certain time, we look at the forefathers of America and whatever in terms of slavery, and to some extent you cut them some slack because you go, well, everyone was doing it. Like there's a difference between being a slave trader 300 years ago and being a slave trader today. There's a different level of culpability to it.
What about books? Because in recent years in the United States, there have been schools that have withdrawn certain very, very famous popular books, like Huckleberry Finn, which
Kill a
used
Mockingbird.
the word nigger regularly, apparently.
Yeah.
And yes, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah. So...
which was a fantastic novel.
Yes.
Did you read it?
Of course. Every high school student in Queensland read To Kill a Mockingbird.
Well, I didn't grow up in
Blazing Saddles.
Queensland.
Blazing Saddles used to use the word
That's
nigger
right,
a lot
yeah.
as well.
Okay.
Can I play the devil's advocate?
Oh, yeah.
What if your granddaughter's watching The Cosby Show at some point in the future? Trevor, are you going to rush in and turn it off? Or
Well, there's a difference between things that are public and things that are private. Like in the chat room, Wheat Watcher says, I'd be happy if they could ban Mrs. Brown's Boys from TV. A lot of things, it's up to you whether you want to watch it or not. But, for example, if you're going to the football at Ipswich and you said, and they said, "Oh, what time and where is it?" "Oh, it's 3:00 at the Nigger Brown Stadium." You're forced to use that word. Do you know what I mean? Whereas nobody's forcing you to. What was the program you're talking about?
Cosby Show.
Cosby Show. Like that's there for somebody to watch or not watch. You're not forced to use that if you don't want to. When it comes to the names of public places, you are forced to use those, I think, to some extent. So there's my distinction there. So let's deal with the Nigger Brown studio and just say stadium and just say, I think that's one where times change. That's a really potent word. That's one that I think legitimately you say, let's not use that word and we'll find another name for it. Yep.
I had a conversation several years ago with a couple of friends.
Are you going to agree with me or disagree with me on that one?
Well,
I'll
just make a point about how this, what would you say, the social unacceptability of words. It creeps through people's minds, and some people even, I was talking to a couple of friends, a couple of female friends, both white women, one American, one Australian. In Japan, of all places, nobody in earshot would have probably even understood our conversation, let alone been offended by anything we said. And we started talking about racism and language and things like that. And I said, oh, yeah, and, what about, when people say the word nigger? Right. And I didn't use it in any kind of insulting manner at all. I used it as an example of language.
Like we're doing now.
We're doing now.
Yeah.
And both of them, their jaws dropped and they looked at me and they were like, you said that word. And I was like, what's wrong? And they were like, oh, Paul, don't you know how bad that word is?
That makes you a terrible human being, Paul.
Well, I was like, really?
Yeah.
There
was a major executive
mature adults can't even talk about language.
There was a major executive of a big US company who was sacked, and he was in a meeting where he was basically saying, don't use the nigger word.
Yes.
And they said, and he got sacked.
Yes.
And if he'd have said, don't use it was in a context of saying, don't use that word.
Cancel culture.
Yeah. In the chat room, Wheat Watcher says Edwin Brown was a fair-skinned and called N Brown potentially due to his...
It was a nickname. It was an ironic
potentially
nickname.
Due to his favour of a particular variety of shoe polish, according to Wikipedia.
So there was a shoe polish brand...
in favour, something like that.
See, this was what I was getting at.
Shoe polish or something?
Yeah. I had a feeling it was an ironic nickname.
Right, yes. But even then, ironic or not, it's a very potentially, as you've just demonstrated, a highly charged word that is one that I think we can do without.
Okay.
But it does get tricky as words change over time and standards change over time. So statues.
Well, we should be having a conversation about it, and some statues maybe should be brought down, but not in the way that they're being brought down and defaced at the moment. It shouldn't be a vigilante person or group that decides this statue needs to come down. We live in a democracy and we should go about it in a democratic way. We should have a adult conversation about a particular statue and say, well, is it okay that still, is there, or should we replace it with something else? And then if the consensus is to replace it, well, then we'll replace it. But the way we're going about it at the moment in many parts of the world is certain individuals and groups are just taking it upon themselves to smash them down.
You've got something against mob rule, have you?
I'm just a fan of democracy.
Right, okay. We could have all voted and said, hey, let's look at all the statues in the area and decide what we want to.
But also too, I'd like to see people be more pro stuff than anti stuff.
Right.
If erect a statue to someone who you admire, rather than bring down a statue of someone who you think was an asshole.
Yeah,
I think that's a much more positive way of going about things. Put up statues of people you love rather than demand that statues of people you don't necessarily love be.
Do you think it's an attempt of these mobs to cleanse us of impure thoughts? Do you think that's what it's about?
Look,
no, I don't think so.
No,
reminders. If you see a statue of Hitler, for example, it makes you think about Hitler. And
I think
Hitler
it's
was a
frustration.
horrible person, so you shouldn't be thinking about Hitler.
I think
or
it's
something.
frustration in these individuals and these groups. They feel powerless, but then when they bring down a statue, they feel like they've accomplished something.
Paul in the chat room. Paul, did you miss the first 10 minutes again, just based on your comment? Did you, just if you could confirm before you made that comment. I think I can remember with the Soviet Union, with the downfall, and there were all these statues of former Soviet leaders, and I've got the feeling I can remember that they put them all in a park somewhere, like as a park of statues, rather than have them torn down. And but then rather than kind of pretending to celebrate these figures, they gathered them all together and put them in the one location so that they were still historical monuments. And I thought that was a pretty fair way of dealing with it, because
That's a potential
don't
solution.
really
That's
want
a way better solution.
Yeah,
than
you
just-
don't really want statues of Stalin in major intersections.
I think that in Georgia, where Stalin was from, I think they actually still have some statues of Stalin.
Right.
Because he was a local boy, Right. He did well.
Right. Paul says guilty as charged. He missed the first 10 minutes again. So, all right,
Paul, come on, Paul.
Paul, you
Try to keep up.
Yeah.
You've done it again.
Yeah, because I just went into that, Paul. But anyway.
I tell you, it has highlighted some character flaws in these historical figures, though, for me. Like, as someone who's learning a lot about history recently, I had no idea Churchill did some of the things that he did.
He's a terrible racist.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he was someone who I held in a very high esteem.
Right.
And I only sort of knew him for all the good things that he did with his life. And it has provided a balance for me, and it has brought the truth out. There's probably a better way of going about, highlighting some of the negative aspects of Churchill's life.
But are people irredeemably, wrecked if they make a mistake or do something that we now think is bad early in their lives? Because Churchill goes right back to the Boer War, I think, doesn't he? In his involvement with the British government. And he was certainly deeply involved in the First World War and the Gallipoli campaign.
Well, Gallipoli, yeah.
He had a checkered history.
Checkered.
Yes.
That's one way of putting it.
Yes. So...
But do we not sort of say, well, he made up for it in the 1940s
yes.
by, helping Britain to survive the
I think you just
Nazi
paid
onslaught?
an accurate picture of his life, and you highlight both the good and the bad.
Yeah. I mean, if you expect your historical figures to be perfect, then there won't be any statues of anybody.
Except for us, when they build statues of us, because we're pretty perfect.
Good point.
I don't think anyone will find a reason to bring
I made a
bring
mistake.
down
I made a mistake about funding the other week. So there goes my statue. It's down the toilet. It's straight in the
just
river.
be Scott, Warren,
was-
and I then.
admirable humility last week, Trevor. Well done.
What else have we got? Oh, here's the other one I found was interesting. Books. You want to talk about books?
Yes. Well, I mean, we mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird. That was a fantastic book. That was so influential in my life. And I read that, I think, when I was about 13, 14, 15, something like that. I don't remember. It had a profound impact on my thinking about race, specifically about the United States and their history with racism. That really, really influenced my view of how terrible and how unjust the treatment of black Africans was in the United States,
Yes.
And
Just because it's using the terminology of the day
Exactly.
in a stereotype black maid, yes.
And I'm sure I'm not alone in that respect. I'm sure it has influenced literally tens or hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people in their attitudes to that particular issue. Have you read Huckleberry Finn? I mean, that was really a kid's book. That used the word nigger quite a lot, apparently. I haven't checked, but I did go to the trouble of buying a copy before it was sort of banned from the printing presses,
Yes.
So they haven't banned those books, though, have they? They've
They've taken them out of a lot of primary
school
libraries
and a lot of reading lists in school
So
libraries.
they haven't just taken nigger out of it. They've
No, the entire
took the
book.
whole book out,
Yeah,
yeah.
at different times, yeah.
Wow.
So,
But, Huckleberry Finn wasn't really a racist book. It was a book about, white kids and black kids
I don't think I ever
doing
read
stuff together, wasn't it?
it. I don't think I read it. So, yeah.
All right, I'll have a look at it
Okay.
and get back to you.
All right. Yeah. Just on sort of book burning and censorship, we've mentioned this before, way back in episode 211. 1984 by George Orwell warned of how language could be corrupted and weaponised. And that was really, that was one idea. There was a book called Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and it was about book burning. And there was also another one was Brave New World by Aldous Huxley.
Another great book.
All of them about the future dystopian censorship control sort of issues. Orwell feared those who would ban books, sort of from the state, top-down sort of control by the state. And also it was a rewriting of history as well.
It wasn't just banning books.
Yes.
It was about banning words,
Yes.
banning ideas. Because in the book he says...
erasing history and replacing it with something else.
Erasing the tools that people use to formulate ideas.
Yes. And Huxley feared that there would be no reason to ban a book because no one would want to read one, because he was thinking they were in this sort of world where people just didn't care to read books, like they were on...
Soma.
Yes, indeed. So they just wouldn't care. You wouldn't have to ban a book because people wouldn't actually be bothered wanting to read one. And the one that gets overlooked is Fahrenheit 451. It's called that because that is the temperature at which
Paper ignites or
book
something.
burns, was supposedly Fahrenheit 451.
Is it true? Have you ever checked that?
I don't know about that. But in that book, the interesting thing is it is the people themselves who burn the books. It doesn't come from the state. It is a groundswell of people banning...
Like the statue topplers.
And this today is actually... This isn't a top-down thing from government, this sort of censorship. This is really a grassroots of a certain segment of society, but it's not Orwellian in the sense of a state-imposed censorship.
That's a good point.
This is coming from within. This is the thing to consider about all
Yes,
this.
but it's coming from a certain segment of society. It's not coming from the absolute sort of bottom
of course not.
of society.
But it's not coming from the state.
No,
this
you're
isn't
right.
being forced top down.
It's coming from the intelligentsia
Well, and
the so-called chattering classes.
it's certainly coming from grassroots of some form.
I think we can trace its origins, and I've read a little bit about this, I'm sure you have too, but what I've gleaned is that it comes from postmodernism, starting in roughly the 1960s maybe, but certainly picking up momentum in the 1980s and 90s among certain postmodern type academics, fourth wave feminists, people who think, that the West is so terribly, irredeemably corrupted that it has to be destroyed.
Right.
And that's the origin of it.
Yes, but isn't postmodernism also that idea that there is no right answer, it all depends on your perspective?
Yes,
and
that's part of it.
Your own personal truth?
That's part of it, but
Right.
it also includes this idea that the West is so irredeemably bad.
Right.
It has to be torn down
Right.
and replaced with something else.
Right. Yeah.
And this is what they're doing. They're tearing down the artifacts of our civilization, or some of them anyway.
So Churchill statue shouldn't remain. I mean, he's former prime minister of the
He was a
Great Britain.
significant
A significant
historical
national-
figure.
and he had more flaws than most people. But I think we can afford to have a statue of him here and there in London.
Wouldn't you think?
The guy who was like seemingly just a slave trader, who was a rich merchant, who was sort of the first one thrown in the river.
Oh, in
Colston?
yeah,
something like that.
What's the city? Bristol.
Right. So
But he was also a philanthropist. He wasn't just a slave trader. He apparently built schools and hospitals and things like that.
right, from money gained from
Yes.
slave trading. Yeah.
Well, I don't think slave trading was likely his only business, but it was one of them.
Yeah. I don't know. I think with these things, I like the sort of Soviet Union answer to these things is when somebody falls out of favour, then maybe put their statue in some sort of gallery of rogues in a special park somewhere. So,
Did you have any reaction when you saw the statue of Saddam Hussein being torn down during the war? I mean, it was a iconic image, wasn't it, of these Iraqis and Americans helping them,
yes,
pulling down this huge statue of Saddam Hussein.
I was in America at the time. I didn't have a reaction myself, but I observed a massive reaction in the people that I was surrounded by.
Well,
really?
fully understandable by the locals. I mean, you've been
Yeah, he was an absolute piece of work, wasn't he?
right.
That
So if
guy?
they're really bad, it's okay to tear down the statue.
Well, I don't know. I mean, what
it
do
all
you
depends
think?
on your thought, doesn't it? Like if they're an evil dictator, then all's fair. Is that? It's always a question of degree and context in these things.
Yeah,
he probably
just have
had
an adult conversation about it.
He probably didn't have any redeemable features at all, Saddam Hussein. Like at least with Churchill, you could say, well, he was instrumental in winning the war. Can we say anything positive about Saddam Hussein?
What about
Mao
Mao
he kept
Zedong?
everybody in line. Or?
What about Mao Zedong?
Yes,
His portrait is still up there
right.
in Tiananmen Square.
Yes, yep.
They haven't torn it down, and he did some terribly brutal stuff. But of course, he hasn't been. What's the word?
Destatued.
No,
Yeah, that's
can't
it.
think of the word I want now.
Yeah. Paul in the chat room says reference needed for 12th man's definition of postmodernism. Paul, we do this stuff on the fly, mate. Like we can't provide references along the way, but happy to take advice from you, and we'll talk about postmodernism at another
Put it in
time.
the show notes.
Yeah, we can talk about it another time. One I wanted to get to was mass displays of contrition. The footballers kneeling prior to a football match.
Cringeworthy.
I just think
it's cringeworthy.
you've forced a bunch of footballers to make a political statement.
Yeah,
And
that's what they're there for.
and yes,
They're there to
footballers are
play
there
football.
to play football.
To demonstrate their amazing athletic skills and prowess.
And what if they disagreed, but they didn't want to actually make a big song and dance about it?
Peer
what
pressure.
were they to do?
They didn't really have a choice, did they?
It would be impossible to make a silent objection to that process if you just stood there and said, "Look, I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I refuse to be a political pawn in this whole procedure, and I'm just going to stand here." You couldn't have. Like it just that was sort of the red guard, the sort of re-education process. The what was the shaming sort of word we
What
used?
did we
from
use
the other
last week?
Struggle session.
Struggle session.
Almost.
Struggle session, yeah.
I just think if you were a young man and you'd really disagreed, you had no chance of doing it of a silent. You're just forced into that.
your own volition.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you couldn't. You're going to be
You're
dragged
representing
into
your
it.
club, aren't you?
You're gonna be
in that sort of situation. So your actions aren't really your own. Your club has decided. You're an employee of that club.
Yeah, but when you signed up to be a footballer, nobody ever said, "Oh, by the way, we've got these political ideas that we expect you to participate in." They say we expect you to just keep yourself clean, don't get into trouble, and keep your head down, and don't cause us embarrassment. Play football.
This is the insidious nature of this current, set of ideas that's sweeping through the community. Isn't it?
So like in Israel Folau,
I was going to bring up Israel.
so he puts his head up and says, "I want to talk about these issues, and I'm going to be proactively saying this stuff."
Yeah.
And then the football club says, "Well, hang on, what?"
Yeah.
That's quite
Keep your
different
head
to a young footballer who might have been, "Well, I don't really agree with this, but well,
I don't disagree with
if
it
I
either."
if I just stand up straight and don't kneel, the friggin' world is going to fall down on me." So, so
By not doing something, it's actually doing something.
yeah, and you couldn't just be quiet and silent about it. So there we go.
They would probably be accused of white privilege or something like that.
So
I dare say.
So yeah, so two different issues there. So, right, people just get things mucked up as well in terms of like faulty towers. Don't mention the
the
war.
Germans.
Yeah. you know, the whole idea of that show was to portray this asshole Basil Fawlty who had all the foibles and nasty elements of a stuck-up British guy who thought he was way better than he was. Yeah. It's poking fun at him,
absolutely,
rather than at the Germans.
Of course.
So in that situation, Netflix has banned it, a particular. Like it hasn't been banned outright.
It was just that one episode. You know, they didn't ban the whole series. It wasn't a very long series.
And it went back on. It was the sort of ban was lifted or whatever. But
and Gone with the Wind was temporarily withdrawn from streaming services, but reinstated by Netflix, I think it was. And they said that they're going to reinstate it, but put a warning at the beginning of it, warning that, you know, it might depict.
But isn't that their right to choose what they air? Like,
of course it
is.
is.
It's a private company. Yeah.
Of course it is, but should a private company like that be subject to the sort of whims of, you know, the mob, you know?
I think, for example, if we talk about the BBC and its back catalogue, like then in that
it's a different story,
yeah.
Well, the BBC also withdrew several other programs, didn't they? The League of Gentlemen, I think, was one.
Right.
Have you ever seen that? It was a rather bizarre, eccentric comedy. Very, very strange, sort of funny in a way, but a little bit odd. And also Little Britain, because do you remember?
Little Britain.
Yeah, they used to do blackface sometimes. And particularly there was one scene, I don't know if you used to watch it. I used to think it was hilarious.
No.
But they used to put on these fat suits. And there was one character that they did, which was a woman, with dark skin, and she was really, really fat, and she thought she was really sexy. And it was just hilarious because it was just such a grotesque looking character. You know?
Maybe that's offensive to fat people.
Maybe wouldn't you think?
Is that a humour that hasn't really
any humour that takes the piss out of fat people?
It was an edgy humour.
It hasn't passed the test of time.
It was an edgy humour. It came out in the 1990s, I think, didn't it? Little Britain. It's a little bit old now, but I thought it was pretty funny at the time.
In the chat room, Tony says, what if you're an Indigenous person and you disagree? You put up and shut up. Is it really so much to ask white footballers to shut up every now and again? This is referring to footballers and, I guess, national anthems and stuff. Well, Tony, I don't think there should be a national anthem at the beginning of a football match. I just think they should go out there and play. So that would be my solution, that I don't think they should be subjected to that either.
The line between entertainer and politician is becoming very blurred, isn't it? And we saw that on Q&A in that episode. They had two, the black representatives were both actors.
Yes, they were.
So, yeah, it was interesting that there was no Indigenous politicians or activists, or they chose two actors.
Yeah. Or people from some remote community.
And more and more I see that politicians are becoming actors. You know what I mean? Like Scott Morrison, he seems to be acting out a part, you know, rather than being themselves. They're being a version of themselves that they know that people will enjoy.
Well, he's acting out the daggy dad from Cronulla who enjoys his footy and his beer and...
That distinction between actor and politician, it's becoming blurry.
I think it's long been a little bit like that for a lot of politicians, though, hasn't it?
Yeah, but it's getting blurrier as time goes by.
Right. Well, let's talk about Scott Morrison. Let's move
Scotty
on to some
marketing.
Let's move on to some domestic politics, because we haven't talked about anything domestic for quite a while. So. I've got a little subheading here called Morrison cock-ups and shit-fuckery.
Language warning, listeners.
So remember the $60 billion mistake where basically Treasury said to Frydenberg, oops, just done a recalculation here, and some of these guys, when they were filling in the form, thought they were filling in $1,500 and were actually filling in 1,500 employees. So we thought we were going to spend a lot more money than we ended up having to spend. So good news, we've got $60 billion That's a lot of money. But like,
It's really a lot of money.
That is a huge error.
It's a fleet of subs, isn't it? Just about.
It is. Indeed.
Nearly.
Indeed. And everybody wanted to go to town on this hopeless Morrison government on that score. But I actually have some sympathy for them because ultimately...
You're just a big softie.
That's
Trevor.
right, yeah.
He's winning you over.
This whole ministerial responsibility argument, of course, Frydenberg has to rely on the Treasury boffins to tally up these things and to make these estimates. And really, you know, there's a sort of notion that, oh, well, you're responsible for your department and all of its ills and whatnot are your problem as well. But really... He couldn't, you know, there's somebody in
such a hurry as well, wasn't it?
Somebody in a deep, dark dungeon adding up the figures who stuffed it up or didn't spot this error. And so that's really one where I, as much as I hate the Morrison government and Josh Frydenberg, say this whole idea of ministerial responsibility for everything done in your department, which might be 3 or 4 levels down that you've got no involvement for at all, it's just a load of nonsense. So I give him a free pass on that mistake.
Usually there's checks and balances, and he would be responsible for putting those checks and balances in place to make sure that an error like that doesn't happen. But I imagine with the haste that which this was pushed through, that some of those checks and balances were just pushed to one side. And
yes.
So if it had been done over the period of 6 or 12 months, like a normal policy spend like that would have been done, it would have been picked up. But it happened in a matter of weeks, didn't it?
Yeah. But of course, it makes it really difficult for them to say now, well, we can't afford to extend these programs because we don't have the money. But hang on a minute, you were willing to spend that money before, so you do actually have it. So that puts them in a tough spot. The home builder grant is the current one that really gets me.
It's terrible.
This is one where the government is going to give homeowners $25,000 towards the cost of either building a home or a big home renovation. In order to get it, you've got to spend between $150,000 and $750,000 either building or renovating a home. And there's a bit of an income test. Owner-occupiers with incomes below $125,000 for singles and below $200,000 for couples.
Don't get it?
They do get it. So you could be a couple earning $99,000 each and going to do a renovation worth $125,000 and the government's going to give you $25,000. Now, here's the thing is, in order to qualify, you have to sign a contract with a builder by the end of the year. Now,
by the end of this year?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's going to be...
There's only 6 months left.
There's going to be a whole bunch of people who were planning to do this anyway, who are well underway, who have made the decision, going to spend the money, which will flow through the economy, and now they're just being handed $25,000 just as a free gift.
It's ridiculous, isn't it?
And then the idea is this will incentivise people to get more builders and work done. But you've got to be pretty advanced with your decision making in order to get a contract signed before the end of the year.
Indeed.
And you've spent all the money on all the projects that people were already committed to, all that free money that you've given away before you get a benefit for the dribble of extra ones that might come in afterwards who actually go, oh, well, I wouldn't have done it otherwise, but because of this incentive, okay, I'll do it. And I'll do it, and I wouldn't have done it next year. Like, how many would that be?
Yeah, not a significant proportion.
It's just a classic case of middle-class welfare for homeowners. Homeowners are already, we talk about privilege.
Yep.
That's a privileged class.
Yep.
More money for them. So
at least they don't have to be white.
Yeah. Indeed.
There's going to be some good man caves getting about.
Yeah, well, what it's going to mean is that people who've already committed to something are rubbing their hands together and going, oh, great.
Yeah.
Hey, good news, Dale.
It's just
we're going to get a cheque for $25,000.
Free money to people who are already getting by not too badly.
Yes.
And all the people who are struggling, no chance of accessing it.
Where's all the talk? You don't hear anything
copped
about it.
a lot of criticism.
Has it? I haven't read much about it in terms of criticism. You have?
Yeah.
Oh,
I have,
okay.
Yeah.
Right.
deserves it, I think.
Right. This is one of the problems. There's so much going on in the world that some of these sorts of things can slip through.
Yeah.
But why cut it off at the end of this year?
I don't know.
I mean, if he wants to, stimulate the building business by putting money into it, why cut it off at the end of this year? That's just too narrow a time frame, isn't it?
Right. Paul in the chat room says, Trev, what's the time delay on your comments set? Paul, I don't know, but let's do a little test. Let's start a timer, somebody, and then you comment. Hang on, you're going to start a timer, and just don't say anything yet, Paul, in the chat room. Paul. And for the time, there's a stopwatch is about to start.
It's about to start. And comment.
Comment now, please. Okay, there we go. So we'll see what the delay is when your thing appears. All right. Wheat Watcher reckons it's about 20 seconds. It's pretty quick. So there we go. Paul, I can see you now. It's probably
14 seconds.
14 seconds. There you go. It's not easy, Paul, to get to all the comments as they're coming through. I'm doing my best. It's not easy. What else have we got with Scott Morrison? This National COVID-19 Coordination Commission. So what did he do? He said, I'm going to get a group of CEOs together who will work out plans for how we can reinvigorate the economy. I'm going to pay him some money and fees.
Some money?
Yes. Good fees. Get them all together.
Truckloads of money.
Various government departments and entities are going to report to them, and they haven't come out with anything official yet, but the first leaked draft report, it seems that their first suggestion is this is a group stacked with
mining
executives, and their first suggestion is that the government should spend lots of money on infrastructure for mining. What?
What a surprise.
We're copying it. We're copying this.
Did not see that coming.
No.
Where is the uproar of this? Like, this is ridiculous that this could possibly happen, but it is, and nobody cares. You could walk down the street and say, have you heard about this commission with this Nev Power character? And
what's his connection with COVID-19 anyway?
Nothing. And his connection with businesses, he's been in charge of a mining group. But, a bit like what we were saying earlier, his identity is as a mining executive. That doesn't make you an expert on all things of the economy and how to kickstart Australia after a pandemic.
Is Hillsong's Brian Houston on that committee?
I don't know, but
you wouldn't be surprised.
I wouldn't be surprised. But and supposedly they've declared their conflicts of interest in a private register, which we never get to see, and they're supposedly, being cognizant of any sort of conflicts that they might have. But this is the whole point of a public service. You have a public service where people don't have a conflict, they're independent, at least they don't have skin in the game. They can make decisions not because of potential benefits, one would hope. So
we could do it, Scotty, if you're listening. We're up for it.
Yeah. What else did he do? COAG. So it used to be the Premier's Conference. He scrapped and said...
Sorry, before you go on, I think it's worth mentioning the amount of money that guy's going to be paid. And apparently it was listed as to cover his expenses.
Travel expenses.
Like,
$250,000.
Motels and...
$267,345. Right.
That guy travels pretty luxuriously.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Also, he's going to scrap the Council of Australian Governments. So previously that was the premiers getting together once a year and for a meeting, and then he's going to continue with this National Cabinet meeting. And he says, with a specific focus of creating jobs, jobs, jobs. It's going to be all about jobs. If I was the Premier, I would say, fuck off. I want my old COAG back. Because we're going to talk more than just jobs.
Yes.
Like, the world is not just about jobs.
A whole range of issues they need to discuss.
Yeah, so I don't care about your National Cabinet. It's just going to talk about jobs.
The National Jobs Cabinet.
Yes.
Just rename it.
Yeah. Gets away with murder again.
Why aren't the premiers challenging him on that? Does he get to decide?
They're not brave enough to tell a story to the public and say... I'm more concerned with other things, not just jobs. There are other topics on my agenda. I don't think I don't know. Maybe they can't break through as well as I don't know. But I looked at it and I just thought, you could be kidding. That's what I
Reason
do.
to be suspicious for sure.
Yeah. There's one good thing though that I did see. Did you see him having his press conference? And there's a video of it. This is great.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Scott Morrison's having a press conference.
Get off my lawn.
And the
yes,
media scrum is kind of edged its way off the footpath and onto this guy's lawn. And Scott Morrison starts talking to his press conference, blah, blah, blah. And this guy calls out from his patio, "Hey, you lot, you're on my lawn. Can you move on? I've just seeded my lawn."
That's right, yes.
And Morrison...
No, trampling it.
Morrison go, "Oh, sorry, mate. Hey, come on, everyone. Let's get off the guy's lawn." To me, that was the most Australian thing you will ever see. Like, it just would
I
not
could imagine
happen.
you doing that, Trevor, if Scott Morrison rocked up
well, I
out
just-
the front.
He will get a lot of brownie points for that because it makes him look like an authentic Aussie dad, you know,
Oh, it might have been
protecting
a setup.
Yeah.
the lawn.
It would be a clever setup. It's that's too clever. But as a marketing exercise, that was just funny. I mean, can you imagine another country in the world where your average Joe yells out to the Prime Minister, "You get off my lawn. I just seeded it." And the Prime Minister goes, "Oh, genuinely, sorry, mate. Come on, everyone, just come forward a bit. Like, that's the guy's lawn after all."
Well, the lawn is sacred in Australia.
Yes.
After all,
Yeah.
it's a sacred site.
You haven't seen mine, obviously. You come at night time.
Not recently.
It's not in a good condition. So I thought that was funny. Paul Waper says that was in Murrumbatum near Canberra. Thank you, Paul. Right. Conspiracy theories.
Oh, I love conspiracy theories.
What's your favourite?
My favourite is 4% of US adults believe the world is controlled by reptilian overlords.
4%, is it?
4%.
That's quite a lot of Americans.
That is a lot.
That's 12.5 million Americans.
Gosh.
Not just overlords, reptilian overlords. It's very specific. They're big lizards.
Yeah.
Did you
And
ever
they
see
rule the
that
world.
science fiction TV series? It must have come out in the 1990s, I think. And it was about that. It was about the reptilian overlords. And every now and then they would sort of peel their faces off.
Right.
And they were like big lizards.
Well, that's where they
underneath.
get this idea from.
Exactly.
Yes.
I wonder what would it take to start a conspiracy theory. Could we start one? Could we plant a seed?
Oh, I don't know.
Try.
Yeah, I was talking to my daughter about this before, about conspiracy theories, and I really hate them because it's a view of the world where you think that there's, because she was talking about are there people who have discovered a cure for cancer who have not released it because they're making money from
Big pharma.
cancer? Yeah.
Yep.
And I was like, what you're really suggesting is that there's a group of people who have the knowledge who are consciously deciding not to do it. Like so many people, conspiracy theories necessarily involve a number of people who are all agreeing together to do a really nasty thing. It's a really grim view of human nature that you could get 20, 30, 50, 100 people who would all agree to such a horrible sort of concept. I just think if you can believe in a conspiracy theory, you've got a really grim, dark view of the world. That's the part I don't like about conspiracy theorists. Are not just nutty; they actually are really they're kind of
Paranoid.
and a nasty view of human nature. That
I
they
often
think,
wonder if it's got something to do with modern drug use,
right,
because a lot of your sort of modern drugs create
create a
paranoia.
Yeah, it could be.
So, people getting drugged up, they think up these outlandish ideas, and then when they come out of their drugged up state, that sort of sticks in their head somehow. I don't know.
Could be. Just getting back to conspiracy theories, Bill Gates. So there was a survey from Yahoo News of Americans, and over 40% of Republicans think Bill Gates will use COVID-19 vaccine to implant tracking microchips.
That was alarming. Over 40%. I think it was 44%.
Yeah.
The more alarming statistic for me was that it was 28% of all US adults, regardless of which way they voted.
Yeah.
28,
bizarre,
nearly a third.
Yeah.
Implant tracking microchips. Bill Gates.
Yeah.
Poor Bill Gates. He's
32% of US adults don't know or not sure, and 40% say false. I think I posted this on the Facebook page, and
You
I
did.
was commenting with somebody, and they said, "Oh, the really alarming figure is the not sure category." And I thought to myself, well, maybe there's a significant number of people who just don't know who Bill Gates is. I don't know, maybe like because Dean Stretton said, "Well, the don't know category isn't so bad because maybe people just don't know anything about anything and just say, oh, I don't know." So maybe the no figure is not so bad. But yeah, so that's from Yahoo News. I don't know how many people were surveyed as part of that. And you think to yourself, those crazy Americans, lucky that doesn't happen here.
Hang on a minute.
And then you come across
Hold it
another.
right there.
Yeah, and then you come across another poll done in Australia. And by the looks of it, I think this one might have been a essential poll. I'm not sure. I've got it here in front of me. But there's a question to Australians. I think it was essential poll. Here are some things people have been saying about COVID-19. They are all things that some people say are true and others say aren't true. To what extent do you believe that each of the following to be true or false? And one of the statements is, Bill Gates played a role in the creation and spread of COVID-19. And this is Australia, and 13% said true.
Come on, Australia. You're better than that.
71% said false. 15% don't know. And in the trues, it was 4% was definitely true and 9% were probably true, which made up the 13%. So also that the COVID-19 virus is not dangerous and is being used to force people to get vaccines. Again, 13% thought that was true. Actually, I might put this up on the on the screen for the
So
people
we can
looking at
safely
this.
say at least 13% of Australians got a screw loose upstairs, haven't they?
Well, they know more than we know. And also...
and they vote.
yeah.
Yes.
Their vote counts as much as yours, Paul.
Yeah. And the other one in it was the 5G wireless network is being used to spread the COVID-19 virus. Oh, that was only 12%.
It's pretty close. Probably the same group.
Yeah. You would think it's the same group of people. So that's pretty alarming that 13% say definitely true or probably true that Bill Gates played a role in the creation and spread of COVID-19.
Is it just an extension of superstitious thinking? Somehow, is it somehow linked to that? Because we're seeing a drop in religiosity. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Religiosity?
Religiosity. But the people that are opting out of religions are taking up some other wacky sort of superstition, aren't they?
Spiritualism, often.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a...
So that percentage of the population that...
Yeah.
I'm inclined to think there's a bit of an overlap. I wouldn't necessarily think they were all the same people, but there is a bit of an overlap.
Well, in America, where it's a highly religious society, even more people think these crazy things.
Yes, good point.
There we go.
Yeah, what causes that? And wouldn't you like to be able to identify them and
Do you remember
revoke their right to vote?
Right.
some weeks ago I sent you a link to a video of an Australian guy who's basically a herbalist. Do you remember that one?
I don't know.
He's based in Sydney. I won't mention his name to avoid litigation, but he's based in Sydney and has a business selling basically magic potions made by immersing Australian bush plants in water and sunlight.
Right.
And then he bottles it and he sells it to mugs who pay him, I don't know how much money, for these bottles of magic water.
Right.
And he made a video about the 5G conspiracy.
Okay.
And he was claiming that it was dead set real.
Right.
And so the people who buy the magic water,
Yes.
he seems to think would also be interested in the 5G conspiracy theory. So there you go. There is a bit of overlap there, I would say.
It's entertaining in a way, though, isn't it?
No, it's depressing.
It would be if it was a TV show, but it's for real, Warren.
I saw one recently. There's a group of people who have started taking their pants off, laying on their backs, and presenting their anuses towards the sun.
Say what?
It gives them some sort of special power.
Oh, right.
Letting the direct sunlight hit their anuses.
Right.
Yeah, there's YouTube clips of it.
Letting the sun shine where it's not supposed to shine. Right.
Yeah, it's very energising, apparently.
Right. No.
Have you tried it?
Of course I have.
You were up at Noosa today, weren't you? You had a perfect opportunity.
Yeah.
People.
More testing required.
Noosa,
that's all I'm going to say.
I reckon there's a
More
lot of people in
testing
Noosa
required.
do that sort of stuff.
Probably.
There were a lot of people attended the protest for the anti-vaccination sort of stuff. This happened sort of before the George Floyd and the incarceration protests kicked off. Just before then, there was some sort of anti-vaccination protesters, and
In Australia?
yes.
Oh.
So they had hundreds of them turned up. So. Like it was way more than we could get for an anti-religious, against the religious discrimination bill.
Yeah.
And you looked at it and thought, oh my God, we
How
struggled
many
to
did
get.
we have there? About 200 or 300?
Yeah, and they seem to have way more than that for their crazy 5G nutbag theory. So it's depressing, I think.
If I could put a plug in for another podcast, Not As Smart As You Think You Are.
Right.
Have you heard of that podcast?
I have heard of it.
Yeah, he's does a really he's done a really good podcast on conspiracy theories.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
have a listen to that one.
What's it called?
Not As Smart As You Think You Are.
Right. In the chat room, I'm looking for new podcasts because I don't find many, other than this fine podcast, there's not many good ones out there. So if you've
This
got
is
a
all you need,
recommendation,
really.
yeah, if you've got a recommendation for a podcast, I'd like to hear it. Oh, look, we're kind of getting up to time here. I think I saw something where Jeff Bezos was potentially getting close to becoming a trillionaire. I didn't look at the figures, but
Trillionaire.
Yeah, yes.
He's a bit of a try-hard, isn't he, that Jeff Bezos?
You see, Amazon is opening in, a warehouse is opening in Brisbane.
Brisbane, yeah. Out at Lytton.
Just the number of mum and dad businesses that are falling over due to this pandemic and the rise of Amazon, it's worrying.
Trevor.
Yeah.
Anastasia Palaszczuk said it's going to create 200 jobs.
Did she?
She did. It's
A
going to
whole
create
200.
jobs.
Did she really?
It's good for Brisbane and Queensland.
200.
It's going to create
And
jobs.
did she say how many jobs it was going to kill off?
Destroy.
That's details. Don't think about that.
Well, and there's a quality of job. There's a shit job and there's a good job. And working as a picker in an Amazon factory, that's a shit job. Yeah. So anyway, it looks like he's getting close to that.
Let's hope he does good things with that money.
Now, we've got to be very careful on this one. Litigation, defamation, warning, gentlemen. Be very careful what you say on this one. Clive
Warning
Palmer.
noted.
Clive Palmer. So Clive Palmer's a bit like, who was that radio guy? Alan Jones. If we're going to start talking about these guys, careful with
I
our
might
words.
just turn my microphone off.
Yeah, do that. So there was a thing I saw in the paper where the leader of the opposition in Queensland has been under pressure from the backroom boys in the sort of party headquarters who are trying to oust her out, is the allegation. And there was an article in the paper which said that an uncomfortable number of higher up people in the Liberal Party
Campbell Newman is one of them. Is that right?
No,
he's
one of the high up who's accused of sort of plotting.
Yeah.
He's denied sort of plotting. But what I'm getting at is the number who have got some sort of financial connection to Clive Palmer.
Yeah.
And in that they're either, there's LNP President Dave Hutchinson, who it is said works for Palmer as a property consultant. The LNP founder and past president Bruce McIver, who is a director of Palmer's Palmer Leisure Australia company. And there's LNP State Executive Member Malcolm Cole, who works for SAS Group, which provides communication services for Palmer, and Federal Nationals President Larry Anthony, owner of SAS Group, which provides communication services for Palmer. So there's an uncomfortable number of people who have some sort of financial relationship, it seems, with Clive Palmer.
One is an uncomfortable number of people.
So
Wasn't Clive Palmer formerly a member of the LNP?
I think so. He had a
Yes.
falling out with Campbell Newman, didn't he?
Yeah. So when Campbell Newman got elected, he walked into Campbell's office and said, "Great, congratulations! Now I want you to do this and do that."
Approve my mine in the Galilee Basin.
Or it might have been a railway line or something like that.
I think it was his, Adani mine.
The allegation is that he walked into Campbell
The
Newman's
allegation, yes.
office and sought certain things to be done with an expectation that it would be done because he knew them and that they would want to do this, and that there was sort of pushback from Campbell Newman to say, not so fast. And he wasn't so happy about that, and then created his Palmer United Party as a result of that sort of
falling out.
Yeah, as a result
Allegedly.
of all that. Yes. All of those caveats there. So that's interesting to see what's going on there.
The impact of money on politics is worrying, isn't it? It's getting worse.
Well, you've said to me before, what's the problem with billionaires and whatever? And I've said they're too powerful is a problem. That it's chicken feed for them.
It's the political power that money buys.
So
I have a big problem with that.
Yeah. So we're moving on from Clive Palmer. Put a line on that. We're just talking billionaires in general now.
Yeah.
They've got too much power to buy.
Well, the
influence.
ability to get power.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know what the solution is, but you've spoken at length on this podcast about the effect of, religion in politics. I think the impact of money
just as big.
Yeah,
absolutely,
or worse even.
Yes, and it's sort of
getting worse.
But they're tied together because money. Thinking of the American example, basically, money hitched itself to the evangelical movement because it needed boots on the ground and people in pre-selection and that sort of thing. And basically, money and corporate interests wanted tax rates down, and they wanted red tape out of the way, and they wanted a free-for-all in terms of access to the market. And they basically said to the evangelicals, we'll give you your moral things that you want in terms of we'll push back against abortion laws, we'll put these conservative judges in place, we'll give you all that stuff that we don't care about.
All that sort of stuff, yep.
So you can have all those sort of moral issues provided you back us up on the money issues, and we'll back you up on the moral issues if you... Yeah, so that was a sort of... That's how that panned out, and that's how it will pan out here as well, because that's how
we just
follow their lead.
They both start with M, and they're both 5-letter words.
Right. Money and...
Moral.
Oh, right. Thank you. Yeah. Two go hand in hand. So...
what's the solution?
The solution is... a situation that's so horrendous and everybody in such a bad way that they finally wake up and say, we can't do this anymore, we need to drastically change the system. But while it's not too bad and we're all not too bad, then there's no change. Like, people won't be motivated enough to change. This is the problem, that the religious groups are so motivated. They can get 500 Mormons to attend at a branch somewhere. They can say, be there at this time and keep an eye on your phone because a text message will come which will tell you how to vote. Do it. And they'll do it. A small number of highly motivated people can take control, and people are not motivated enough because we're okay sort of really...
We need to gather the atheist mob. The secular atheist mob.
Impossible. Yes. Yeah.
I think a cap on advertising. Political advertising.
Well, it should be no donations.
No donations.
$50 maximum.
Only donations from individuals, and $50 maximum.
Yep. Because why are you making a donation if not to get a favour back of some sort, some influence, time, favour?
And that donation, they use that to buy advertising space.
Yeah. I would go further.
I think, most people have got access to the internet. If you want to advertise what your political party is all about, put it on your website.
Yeah.
You can't spend $2 billion on a website, can you? And a $2 billion website is going to be no more effective than a $2 million.
That would be sending Apple laptops out to potential voters in the mail, wouldn't it, with $2 billion, but so that they could look at your website. But I would go further. I would ban political donations completely and legislate.
Well, it's not really necessary, is it?
It's not. Because advertising on the internet is so cheap. And legislate for the state to actually provide a set amount to each candidate, just each registered candidate. What could be fairer?
It sounds like a pretty simple solution.
Wouldn't you think?
Yeah.
Maybe it's too simple.
Yeah. The other one, just getting back to billionaires, I reckon we should just say to billionaires, once you hit $1 billion, congratulations, you've won. You've reached the finish line.
$1 billion, yeah.
And at this point onwards, there's no point. We're just going to take everything. So congratulations. You can just sit back and relax now because the game's over. The race is finished. And really, you don't need anything beyond this. You're just becoming way too dangerous. We should just say $1 billion, that's it. And see you later.
You would only create...
A wealth tax.
Yeah, well, you only create incentives for dishonesty, Trevor, when you do that. Because people would just hide it.
Of course they would. But wouldn't it be fun to track it down? So,
good luck.
And to some extent, you can't hide it. Like if you own a mine in Australia and it is worth $2 billion and you own the whole thing, well, it's right there in front of you.
I saw a movie about Scots people the other night. The
Scots
Accountant.
people.
Have you ever seen that movie, The Accountant?
I did see that. Yeah, that's nothing to do with Scott. Yeah.
And this guy had this trailer full of gold bullion and cash and all sorts of expensive original paintings and stuff.
He was some sort of crazy hitman or something.
Yeah, he was an amazing hitman. He was an amazing fighter. But anyway.
Back to Bezos. He just went through a divorce. Just keep that in mind.
Yes.
Lost a significant amount of his wealth.
Yeah.
So, and he's still going to become a trillionaire.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think you made the point, didn't you, that he just works 120 billion times harder than anybody else?
No, I didn't make that point.
Who made that point? I
was
saw
in the
that
show
somewhere
notes.
in
It was
the show notes.
I don't know.
Someone tweeted it.
Anyway, we're getting to the end of it now, I think. Unless anybody had something really pressing they wanted to say, I'm going to call
Nothing
time
pressing
on
from
this
me.
one. No. So
Did we offend anyone tonight?
I don't know. I think we might have offended Paul if he gets back to the first 10 minutes. He got in late again and said things. So
Just choose not to be offended, Paul.
yeah.
It's that easy.
All right. Next week, keep an eye out on Facebook. If you're not already, hit the like button or the follow button or whatever on Facebook so that you see any messages. I might be doing this on a Monday night. I might be just recording audio. I might not do anything. I don't know. So, but we'll definitely be back the week after that. So
Why don't you do a light entertainment show instead, a bit of song, a bit of dance,
right.
display some of your paintings
Blackface?
Maybe.
in blackface.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. All right. Thank you out there, dear listeners. You might hear from me on Monday, not sure. If not, definitely the following Tuesday. We'll see you then. Bye for now.